The evidence is undeniable. He hears every detail of what happened, and in an instant, the worst nightmare of his life is shattered. Joseph, the son that he had mourned for 20 years, he's alive. Well, we're coming to the end of this incredible journey through the life of Joseph as we continue verse by verse through the book of Genesis and ultimately through the entire Bible. But think back to how it all began for Joseph using our visual timeline, where Joseph was just a teenager living in his father's house when God began to give him dreams about the future, and then everything fell apart where he was betrayed by his own brothers and thrown into a pit, forgotten in prison, and falsely accused. And we studied and read how he goes from one dark valley through another, but through every pit, every setback, and every delay, God, He's been quietly building a bridge. And over the last few chapters, we've watched the various spans of that bridge come together through a series of crises until we arrived in our last study at one of the most emotional moments in all of Scripture, where Joseph, now the prime minister of Egypt, he dismisses all the Egyptian officials, and including his interpreter through who he'd been speaking through, and for the first time in over 20 years, spoke to his brothers who betrayed him in his native language, in Hebrew. And he said, "I am Joseph." And what a moment and a picture of forgiveness and reconciliation. Because Joseph, he had absolute power. As the ruler of Egypt, all he had to do was snap his fingers, and the very brothers who had betrayed him so deeply, they would have been executed. But instead of revenge, he chose grace. Instead of punishment, he extended mercy. Instead of making him pay for what they had done to him, he forgave them. Well, as we've witnessed, God has really accomplished what seemed absolutely impossible: the restoration of these broken family relationships. Well, last week we learned that the road to reconciliation, the road to deep forgiveness, it's paved with God's sovereignty. But here's what's easy to overlook. That restoration, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't the result of just one emotional moment. No, it took 20 years. And that brings us to another important lesson, when it's not just talking about forgiveness, but broken relationships, and even broken relationships in our families. Here it is. It's that God's timing, it's always perfect. He's rarely early by our standards, but he's never late by his. And by the way, if you're wondering where I'm hiking for this study, well, leave your best comments, your best guess in the comments, and see how close you can get, and then just stick around to the end, because I'll reveal the location so you can discover this incredible hike for yourself. And just between you and me, if you leave a comment in the comments of where you think I am, and you're first and closest to where I am, not just the town, but where I am, what trail I'm on, just leave your comment there, and I'll contact you with a direct message, and I'll send you a gift card for some coffee. So if you don't know where I am, just fast forward to the end, because the first one who places it is going to get the coffee. But let's pick it back up where we left off in Genesis chapter 45. We left off verse 15, so let's pick it up in 16. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Well, up until last week, Joseph had kept his identity a closely guarded secret. I mean, he knew God was working. He could see the bridge God was building between him and his family. But no one else could. Not his brothers, not his steward, and not the Egyptians. Everyone, they were just walking through a fog, trying to make sense of what God was doing. And then last week, the fog lifted. Joseph dismissed all the Egyptians, turned to his brothers, and changed everything by saying, I am Joseph. And it had been Joseph all along. And even more astonishingly, he had completely forgiven them. I mean, how is that possible? And we learned it's because Joseph understood something that his brothers didn't. He recognized that behind their evil choices, God didn't cause his evil choices, but the sovereign hand of God used them to send Joseph along ahead of them to Egypt to preserve and save many lives. But here's an interesting question. Remember, Joseph dismissed all the Egyptians. So how did Pharaoh hear about this? Well, remember the first couple of verses from our last study. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph, he may have dismissed the Egyptians, but he couldn't hide his emotions. His weeping echoed through the palace, and word quickly spread. Before long, Pharaoh himself heard the news. Now, why would this please Pharaoh so much? Well, to answer that, it's helpful to compare what the biblical account says with what historians tell us about Egyptian history and their ancient history. Because when we picture Egypt, we usually imagine a picture from the movies where it's one mighty empire ruled by an all-powerful Pharaoh. And eventually, that is what Egypt becomes. But during Joseph's lifetime, Egypt was still growing into that role on a global stage. It was already a united kingdom. I mean, that had happened centuries earlier with a centralized government. But it hadn't yet reached the heights of the international dominance for which we think of, and it would later be famous for. And that's what makes Joseph's story and the timing of it so fascinating. I mean, Lord willing, we're going to get to chapter 47 here in a few studies, and we'll look at this in much greater detail. But during what it says is, during the famine, people started by spending their money to buy the grain until all their money was gone. And then they sell all their livestock for the grain. And after that, they actually sell all their land to Pharaoh so that he controls it all. And then finally, they even sell themselves into Pharaoh's service in exchange for food. This was a massive consolidation of power and centralization of authority. So, think about what happened. By the end of the famine, the wealth, the land, and all the labor of Egypt had all been centralized under Pharaoh's authority. I mean, humanly speaking, Joseph, his God-given wisdom, didn't just preserve Egypt from starvation, it dramatically strengthened the throne itself. Now, I'm not saying that Joseph single-handedly created the Egyptian empire. I mean, history is way more complex than that. But when you compare the biblical account with Egypt's continued rise to become the dominant power in the ancient world, it's reasonable to see Joseph's administration as one of the key ways that God strengthened Egypt for generations to come. I mean, just think about that. From Pharaoh's perspective, Joseph, he hadn't simply interpreted a dream. He hadn't merely saved millions of lives. Through Joseph's wisdom, the kingdom had become a lot stronger, wealthier, and even more centralized in power than ever before. Well, humanly speaking, no one had done more to increase Pharaoh's power or to secure his reign than Joseph. So when word reaches Pharaoh that Joseph has finally been reunited with his long-lost family that he had spoken about for years, I mean, the king, he's genuinely delighted. I mean, at last, Pharaoh has an opportunity to honor the man who had done so much for him and for all of Egypt. It reminds me of one of my favorite scenes in Return of the King. After the battle, it's all over, and Aragorn is crowned the king of Middle Earth. Well, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, they stand before him, and as the entire kingdom gathers, the four hobbits instinctively begin to bow before their new king. But Aragorn stops them and says, "Oh, my friends, you bow to no one." And then something unforgettable happens. The king, he bows before the hobbits. And one by one, the entire kingdom follows. Why? Because everyone, they recognized a powerful truth, is that without those four unlikely heroes, there would be no kingdom left to rule. Aragorn's crown existed because of their sacrifice. Well, in a similar way, Pharaoh hears that Joseph's brothers have arrived. He doesn't see them as strangers. He sees them as the family of the man who saved Egypt. So Pharaoh, he's not simply being polite here. He's looking for a way to honor the man to whom he owes so much. Well, verse 17, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." You are also directed to tell them, "Do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and for your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." Well, now, Pharaoh has heard so much about how much Joseph's family means to him. And if he's done this much for Egypt, Pharaoh wants to honor the man all he can for saving his kingdom. So he gives Joseph's family the very best that Egypt has to offer. The best land, the best provisions, the best transportation. In fact, Pharaoh says, "Don't even bring your belongings. Leave them behind, and I'll give you better ones." It reminds me of the HGTV Dream House sweepstakes. Have you ever seen this? So every year, HGTV, someone wins a fully furnished dream home in an incredible location, complete with a luxury SUV in the driveway and $500,000 cash. All they have to do is sign up and then show up to take the keys. Well, that's essentially what happened to Joseph's family. They were given the land of Goshen, the crown jewel of Egypt. And while much of Egypt receives less than an inch of rain a year, that's even less than we get here in Montrose, Goshen, it sat in the fertile Nile Delta, continually nourished with water from the Nile River in an agricultural society. I mean, there was no better place to live. Joseph and his family, they had literally just won the Egyptian HGTV Dream House. Not because they entered a contest, but it was because who earned it. It was because of who their brother was and what he had done. And notice the timing. This blessing didn't come 20 years earlier. It came when Joseph was in the right position and his brothers had grown and their hearts had been transformed and changed, and God had prepared the way. You know, God's timing, it's always perfect. Well, verse 21. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. So we actually have ancient Egyptian artwork depicting carts like the ones Joseph sent. Here it is. So think of these carts that Pharaoh provides as the ancient version of a U-Haul. I mean, make no mistakes. These weren't little wagons for a weekend trip. These were the moving trucks of the time, the best. They had to carry an entire family. Jacob, his sons, their wives, children, grandchildren, servants, supplies, livestock, and yes, even their pet goldfish. Pharaoh wasn't inviting Joseph's family for a weekend visit. He was telling them, you're moving to Egypt permanently. Verse 22. To each of them, he gave new clothing. Do you catch the irony? And the very brothers who once stripped Joseph of his clothing are now being clothed by Joseph. Remember back to chapter 37. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cisterns. Well, 20 years earlier, they had ripped the robe from Joseph's back, humiliating him and leaving him for dead with nothing before selling him into slavery. Well, now the tables have completely turned. Joseph isn't taking clothes from his brothers. He's giving him new ones, the best. I mean, not just any clothes, but the finest garments Egypt had to offer. A nation, by the way, for thousands of years that has been famous for producing the best cotton in the world for thousands of years. And isn't that just like God's grace? The hands that once stripped Joseph are now receiving gifts from Joseph. Now, that's what forgiveness and restoration looks like. It doesn't merely refuse to pay evil with evil. It overcomes evil with good. Well, verse 22 continues. But to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And then Joseph, he gives Benjamin a special gift, 5 sets of the finest Egyptian clothes and 300 shekels of silver. Why? Because Benjamin was Joseph's only full brother. I mean, the only other son of Rachel. But there's probably another reason here. Remember how Joseph had been testing his brothers earlier. Benjamin received 5 times as much food as everyone else. Well, now he receives 5 times the clothes and a large gift of silver. I mean, would the brothers become jealous again? Is he still testing him? I don't know. But apparently they were fine with it. That jealousy that once tore his family apart, it's been healed. It's been replaced by changed hearts, and here's just more evidence of it. Well, verse 23. And this is what he sent to his father. 10 donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for the journey. Notice something else, is that Joseph sends the gifts of donkeys not on carts. Remember, the carts, they're going to be essentially U-Hauls. They were for moving the family. The donkeys, however, they carried the cargo, provisions and supplies and the finest gifts that Egypt had to offer for his father. At first, that might seem pretty inefficient. I mean, why haul all these gifts hundreds of miles to Canaan only to turn around and bring everyone back to Egypt? Well, it's because Joseph understood two things. First, Jacob, he had no idea that Joseph was still alive. And second, Jacob had every reason not to trust his 10 older sons. And they had deceived him once before, if not more than that. And Joseph, he couldn't leave Egypt. He still had a nation to govern. So he sent undeniable evidence instead. These Egyptian gifts, they weren't just presents, they were proof. They were a proof of life, a proof that Joseph was alive, proof that Joseph ruled Egypt, proof that this unbelievable story that the brothers were about to tell their father was 100% true. In modern terms, it's as if the brothers showed up and said, "Dad, not only is Joseph alive, but we just won the Egyptian HGTV Dream Home sweepstakes. So pack your bags, we're moving." Well, verse 24. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." I love that. It's because Joseph knows exactly what the enemy knows, is that division is deadly. I mean, God has spent all of these years building this bridge of restoration, healing a family that was so broken beyond repair. The last thing that Joseph wanted was for his brothers to start arguing on the journey home, just to undo and undermine what God had done. He simply said, "Don't quarrel along the way." So Joseph, he wasn't just sending his brothers home. He was protecting the healing that God had begun. Well, verse 25. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is the ruler of all Egypt." I mean, Jacob obviously was stunned, and he didn't believe them. I mean, again, 20 years Jacob had lived under crushing weight of grief. Remember how deep his grief was? Back in chapter 37, all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Think about that. I mean, for 2 decades, Jacob's life had been defined by the loss of Joseph. He refused to be comforted because he believed he would never see his son again. And who brought him the news that Joseph was dead? Well, these 10 brothers. So when they suddenly show up saying again, "Hey, Joseph is alive," Jacob doesn't believe a word of it. I mean, why would he? The last time they came with news about Joseph, it was wrapped in deception. Well, verse 27. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph sent to carry him back, the spirit of his father Jacob revived. I love this moment. Because Jacob, he didn't believe his sons until he sees the carts, these Egyptian carts, the best. And the evidence is undeniable. He hears every detail of what happened. And in an instant, the worst nightmare of his life is shattered. Joseph, the son that he had mourned for 20 years, he's alive. And then Moses records these beautiful words. The spirit of their father revived. Don't miss that. For 20 years, grief had drained the life out of him, but now his spirit comes alive again. And remember his name, Jacob. It meant heel catcher, the one who wrestles, strives, and fights. For years he's been fighting through life and weighed down by sorrow. But now his spirit is revived. The fight, it's back, only this time Jacob doesn't have to fight for himself. He remembers he's Israel, or contends with God. In other words, God fights. The God who had been fighting for him all along had brought him to this moment. God had done what 20 years of human effort could not. He had restored what everyone thought was lost. And while verse 27 used his old name, Jacob, notice immediately his new name is revived in verse 28. And Israel said, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Well, there's one more question we need to address. Kind of the elephant in the room here is, didn't God promise Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to bless them in the land of Canaan? And haven't we learned through Genesis that Egypt, throughout Scripture, it always pictures the world, like going to the world for help. And yes, that's true. But remember this, God's people are called to be in the world, but not of the world. And more importantly, none of this has caught God by surprise. In fact, God told Abraham that this would happen over 200 years earlier. Remember this? Back in Genesis chapter 15? Know for certain that for 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. So think about that. Long before Joseph was born, long before his brothers sold him into slavery, long before the famine, God had already revealed the entire plan. He told Abraham that his descendants would spend 400 years in a foreign land before returning to the promised land. Why? Well, because Egypt would become God's incubator. Think about what an incubator is. It provides the right environment for life to be protected, to grow. Warmth and protection and everything necessary until the time is right for an egg to hatch. That's exactly what Egypt is for Israel. That when Jacob's family arrived, they numbered about 70 people. Well, 400 years later, they would leave as a nation of millions. During that time, they're protected by what becomes the most powerful kingdom on earth. And God grew this family into a powerful nation. Joseph, he didn't just save his family from a famine. God sent Joseph ahead to prepare an incubator. And then, at exactly the right time, God brought the rest of the eggs, the rest of his family. And 400 years later, at exactly the right time, again, God opened up the incubator. He parted the Red Sea and brought Israel out as the nation that he had promised Abraham. Why? Well, because through that nation would come the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Joseph, he thought he was preparing for a famine, and well, God was preparing him for redemption. In God's timing, it's always perfect. So, where does that leave us? I mean, maybe you're waiting right now. You're waiting for a prayer to be answered, waiting for a relationship to heal, waiting for God to do what only He can do. Well, Joseph and his story, they remind us of this, is that never confuse God's silence with God's absence. You know, Joseph knew God was working, but he couldn't see the whole bridge. Jacob, he didn't know the bridge was being built at all. And his brothers, they certainly couldn't see it. They didn't know what was going on. But God did. Every pit, every prison, every delay, every tear, every reunion, every step was leading exactly where God intended. So maybe you're standing today on one span of a bridge. You're wondering, why hasn't God finished building it yet? Well, don't judge God's plan by the span that you're standing on, because He sees the whole bridge. You only see today's step. So trust in His sovereignty. Trust in His promises. Trust in His timing. Because if God isn't finished, the bridge isn't finished. But remember, it'll finish when it's right. Because God's timing is always perfect. And by the way, if you're wondering where I'm hiking today, this is actually Sutter's Mine, just south of Ouray. And it's one of my favorite hikes because all the hard lifting is at the beginning of the hike. It's kind of straight uphill for about a half mile, but then you get to this flat ground and gives you just this incredible view of Bear Creek Falls. So check that one out too. We'll see you later.